Imagine a world where every threat, ransomware, supply chain attacks, zero-day exploits is stopped before it can even begin. ThreatLocker makes that world a reality with a zero-trust approach to cybersecurity. By giving you granular control and every executable in your environment, ThreatLocker protects your business around the clock. No more guessing, no more gaps. Just rock-solid protection that keeps your operations running smoothly and your data secure. Discover how ThreatLocker's least privilege approach can safeguard your organization against known and unknown threats. Take the first step towards total peace of mind by visiting securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker today. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Security Weekly listeners can save $100 on their full conference pass to the 2025 RSA Conference. RSA will take place April 28th through May 1st in San Francisco and on demand. To register using our discount code, you can visit securityweekly.com/RSAC25 and use the code 5U5SecWeekly. We hope to see you there. All right, for this interview, Tanya Janca joins us today to talk about her latest book, Alice and Bob Learn Secure Coding. Tanya does developer relations at SemGrep, but is also well known for everything she does under the She Hacks Purple umbrella: podcasting, training, fun and silly videos, blogging, and a ton of other stuff. Welcome to the show, Tanya.
Thank you so much for having me, Adrian.
Always delightful to talk to you, and always excited to see when you release something new, like putting out just a lot of good stuff. I'm not going to name names or anything, but I've got friends in the industry where it felt like they did a book just to say they did a book. But yours are very structured to the point to where if people can see behind you there, they can, if we can have Jason hold up his copy, these things are color coordinated. Look at this. Look at the yellow and the purple. There is a plan. Yeah. There's a plan behind your book releases here, Tanya. So what was this feedback from the first book that made you want to do the second one? And was the first book that easy that you're like, yeah, sure, bring it on. I'll do a second one.
So no, the book was not so easy the first time that I thought I would do a second one. After making the first book, then I opened my own academy called We Hack Purple Academy. And I helped create a lot of new application security professionals through that academy and through the book. But all of them told me the same thing. How can I get developers to write more secure code? So I started giving secure coding training to lots of organizations, and I still do that. And basically that became more of a focus because for every new AppSec professional I created, they're like, I just need to reach developers. And so I decided I needed to reach developers. And so this is my effort. I've also started speaking at a lot of developer conferences recently. So I just spoke at Developer Week earlier this month, and then I'm speaking at NDC, which is a giant developer conference in Europe in May. And so I'm trying really hard to reach that audience more. So sort of, how do I word this? So if they write more secure code from the start, then we don't need as many security things later. And so I guess I'm trying to get closer to the genesis.
Right. You start at both ends, somewhere meet in the middle, right? And it's interesting, like just glancing at the cover of both books, they sound like they're very similar. But of course, the intended audience is different. And I often find between the security team and whatever you're trying to secure, whoever the asset owners are, whether that asset be a code base or servers or cloud infrastructure, there's often a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of assumptions about how one side does their job. Particularly, security assumptions like here's a bunch of stuff you need to fix, right? Without understanding what you're really asking them to do in terms of time and disruption and, refactoring and maybe even completely changing the architecture of the application. A lot of people don't realize what they're asking. Is this something that the AppSec folks should be considering reading as well to better understand the other side?
So I'm really biased because I wrote it and I want everyone to buy 100 copies. However,
fair enough.
I would say that, so if someone needs to write a secure coding guideline, basically the the summary of section 1 and section 2. If you add that together, you're going to have a really good one. If you needed to give really in-depth advice about, for instance, I just met with someone and they do embedded systems. And so I'm like, oh, there's pages and pages about how to write more secure C and C++, things to avoid, what you should do and what you shouldn't do, essentially. And she's like, great. So I feel like for those people that have to give guidance. So if you're a pen tester, would I read it? No. But if you're the AppSec person that needs to give a lot of guidance, yes. But my friend Ray LeBlanc, he is telling me, he's like, yeah, this book is great. I bought it. But what I'm going to do is loan it to every dev that I know one at a time, and probably end up getting a whole bunch of copies and like strategically leaving it in places and like, you know what I mean? And he's like, what I really want is for them to read it. And so, which is why I wrote it, right? Like they were my number one goal in that. And although I do cover, in the first book, I cover the secure system development lifecycle and running AppSec programs and stuff in the first book, but it's very, very lengthy. And it's from the point of view of someone that's going to have to build those programs and run them and do all the work. In the second book, the last section of the book is about the secure system development lifecycle, but only about the responsibilities that the developer has and what the experience will be like for them. So for instance, if you're going to attend a threat model, how can you prepare? How can you shine? What's going to be expected of you? So I don't need to teach them all the different methodologies because someone's going to guide them through it, right? Or you've received a pen test report. Ooh, what do I do with this? Apparently my baby's quite ugly. Oh no. I don't know if you've ever been on the receiving end of a pen test report, but it doesn't exactly feel great.
But I've handed out plenty of them.
Yes. You're like, your baby's ugly and your baby's ugly. So like from their perspective, like how do you decide what to fix first? And like, how do you find answers to fix things, etc. Right. So, and how you might be receiving it. Because there's a lot of different ways you receive vulnerabilities as a dev, and not all of them are good. So yeah, and that's like a tiny portion of the book. Most of the book is just secure coding.
Gotcha.
Like, yeah.
And I like the style of book as well. Like, were you inspired by any other books? Because this, nothing against O'Reilly, but this does not read like a typical AppSec book or secure coding book. Like I remember the old, I forget what it's called now, but it was a giant secure coding tome. It felt like it was 3,000 pages or something like that. And this does not read like that.
No. So I really, really enjoyed the Phoenix Project, and then the DevOps Handbook. And then I really loved the Unicorn Project, and I read Accelerate. Then I read Investments Unlimited. So I really like that gang of authors like Gene Kim and friends. And I'm not going to write fiction. That's okay. But I tell stories all the time when I speak. And when I started giving talks, people kept telling me, like when they would comment, it would always be on the stories. And they're like, that's the part I remember. I'm at work and I'm like, oh, Alice would be so upset. Or, oh, that's how Bob got in trouble. And so as I started writing my blog with more and more stories, everyone responded so strongly to them. I'm like, this book needs to have stories. So I tried to have interesting stories that people could relate to. And I've had people comment like, who's Alice? I'm both. I'm Alice and I'm Bob. Many of those things happened to me or someone that I know. Like pretty much all of them are true stories, unfortunately. I might have added a slightly happier ending sometimes, but if you can believe it. Although a few of the GRC stories, I met with a couple GRC people so that they could help me understand more and I could give better assessments of that, because as a developer, I had very bad experiences with GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. Like every time it was like, why won't you let me do my job? It's like all your job is to thwart my efforts to get to prod. So I wanted to give examples of how you could work positively with them and how they could be beneficial to you. because just because I've had bad experiences doesn't mean that's actually how it needs to be or how it is at most organizations. Because I was working in the Canadian government for a lot of my interactions with GRC, and the government and bureaucracy, and oh my gosh. Anyway, I was going to zip it there before I dig myself a further hole.
No, I just back on like the format of the book. I feel like that's it's super powerful because to anyone else who's read the Phoenix Project, like every now and then I'm having a conversation. I'm like, oh, so he's a Brent, And if you haven't read the Phoenix Project, you're not going to know what that means. But if you have read it, okay, like this is the hero, right? The hero that prevents things from coming out of emergency mode, right? And operating normally. But it's a lot easier to just say, oh, that's a Brent, or you have a Brent problem or something like that. It just makes it really, I think, much easier to communicate when you have these characters that you can refer to, that are, analogies for patterns or, for personalities and things like that.
It's funny because I wouldn't have characterized Brent that way. I would have said that his management is bad because because Brent is super capable. They're always assigning every single thing to Brent. Brent's on the edge of burnout all the time.
Right.
No, it's not Brent's fault.
Yeah.
So Brent is like the overstressed person that's working their buns off, that's doing their absolute best, and I remember at Microsoft, some of my colleagues would refer to me as Brent in meetings if my boss assigned me too much work.
Yeah. I was Brent.
Do you think she's Brent? Why are you doing this?
I was Brent, and at some point I realized that I had to leave the organization because as long as I kept like doing
Saving
a bad job at 5 different full-time jobs, they weren't going to hire anyone else to take care of it. So I was actually hurting the company by staying. So that's when I knew it was time. After 7 years at a fintech, it was time to move on, and I moved to. That's when I took my first career move into consulting. But yeah, it's well, and that's also why these stories are important, is so that you can understand some of that nuance, right? Technical books don't really give you that nuance of, oh, like this is how you fix this vulnerability, and here's how you can avoid whole classes of vulnerabilities. But they don't handle, okay, what happens if you have these constraints, or if somebody's telling you to do it this way. Like there's all these human elements that come in and screw all that up, where it maybe should be easy, but it gets complicated real quick.
Yeah, I also wanted to cover some things that I didn't know how to cover in the book. So for instance, when I worked in pen testing, I saw a lot of fraud. A lot of pen testers, so not all of them, but way more than like 10%, right? Which is a lot. In an industry, that's a lot. Like submitting timesheets for 10 days for 2 days work because they're faster than the other pen testers, or they'll just like run a sweep with Burp and Nessus, copy and paste it into Word. And they're like, that's $10,000. And I'm like, no, that's not a pen test. That's nice, but it's not a pen test. And so like how to hire a good pen tester, how to try to sniff out if you're not quite getting what you're paying for, how to talk to someone, how to set, scope, how to set rules of engagement, things like that, because quite often a lot of people, they're hiring one of the people in this call, but they don't know half as much as the people on this call. And so as a result, like whenever I've had people try to interview me for AppSec, they're just like, oh gosh, I don't know what to ask you. Right. And so I'm like, how about we talk about how I'm going to do the job, and I'll, let's just assume I'm qualified, and let's talk, like, tell me some problems you're having and I'll crush them. You know what I mean? And so they're trying to hire someone that essentially is smarter than them at the thing they're hiring them for. And so like how to ask them questions and such. So I felt like talking about these things through Alice or through Bob was really helpful, if that makes sense. And trying to like push people and lead them towards like a more ethical outcome whenever possible.
Ethics. Anybody else want to jump in here?
I really like the human element of it. Kind of what Adrian, as you were talking about the different technical books that are out there that I've tried to read, and most of the time I've fallen asleep while reading. they talk about this and it's in isolation from this, or maybe we'll refer to it a little bit, but there is no human aspect to it. There is no, maybe a mention. You might have this problem or run into this or whatever. And, what I noticed from reading the AppSec book, for example, is it's walking through stuff that I'm thinking, yeah, I've seen something very familiar to that, or, have worked with somebody who had to deal with that. And you're tying the pieces together to where it's, you're starting off here and we're taking a journey through the process instead of, we're going to talk about authentication. And now we're going to talk about cross-site scripting. And now we're going to talk, and you're just like, all right, well,
Very disjointed.
yeah, what do I do with this? So I appreciate that style in the stories. Even if I don't always enjoy it, because the Phoenix Project, if I recall correctly, I just about, had an anxiety attack reading it because of
PTSD.
memories of things that had gone on, and you're just like, oh my gosh, I've got to stop and put this down.
You're like, I am not John.
I do not want to be John.
For those that don't know, John was the CISO and he had some trouble with communicating.
Just a little bit.
Yeah. Another thing with the book that I tried to do is, so I'm dyslexic, and recently I was diagnosed with ADHD, which explains a lot. And
welcome to the club.
Right.
Like a panel of spicy.
But I tried to design the book in a way for people that might not be the best at reading textbooks, because I am not the best at reading textbooks. Like, I read a zillion fiction books a year, but sitting down and reading a technical textbook, I find it so difficult. And when I learned French, so I learned to speak fluent French as an adult in my early 30s. It took 3 years. And I went to a special school for dyslexic and learning disabled adults. And they explained to me, well, there's 21 learning styles. And usually you have a few that you're just awesome at, and then a few you're okay at, and then a few you're like, ooh, really bad at. So you want to avoid those. And if you can make sure you just flow in those styles, then you will pick so I ended up graduating early and passing all the exams. And I remember one day I was leaving French school and there was like a man crossing the street and there was some traffic coming and he was not paying attention. And I started yelling at him. I'm like, dude, get off the street. There's cars there. What are you doing? And he stopped and he looked at me. I'm like, get off the street. Get off the street. Like, you're going to get hit by a car. And he's looking, and I was screaming at him in French. And I didn't even know. And so it was, and I was like, cars! And he jumped off just in time. I was really freaking out at this poor man. Anyway, the point is if you can,
he's not dead.
He's not dead, yes! And none of my readers are going to be harmed in the reading of the book. But like, the idea is that if you can like teach people in the way they learn best, they will absorb way more information and then everyone wins, right? And so that's why it's like, I'm going to have a technical explanation, and then in the second book, especially, like maybe then there's some code explaining it, and then I might have an analogy. And then I might have a bunch of stories as well. And I try to also make you remember it. So I'll tell you stories later in the chapter to bring your mind back to that, which is called recall and is like just another training method. And so I tried to do a lot of those things in the book. And then for those of you that join my newsletter, there's going to be not only free online lessons I'm thinking of starting them in April or May. I'm not sure yet. So every month I'm going to have a free lesson on each chapter of the book for 15 months. And then also I'm giving away a bunch of like cheat sheets on various parts of the book so that you don't have to summarize it. I did it for you with pretty graphics. Yay, art. So I feel I'm trying really hard to get the message across as best I can. And some of my analogies might be silly. Like, I talk about my car. I've only owned 2 cars in my life, a Honda Fit and a Nissan Leaf. And yes, I buy the cheapest car in its category. And but I use that to explain polymorphism and like other object-oriented ideas in the book, and teach an entire lesson on that for clarity before I teach you how to secure it. Right. And I feel like I've had a lot of people say everyone owns a car. So I actually finally get it, because that stuff's complicated. And because it's complicated, we screw it up a lot. And that's where vulnerabilities lie. Right. And so basically whatever I could do to clarify things, I tried really, really hard.
Yeah, I talk to people a lot about that with facilitation. I used to have to teach the Series 7, like your stockbroker exam, and you get 6 weeks to go from 0 to passing it. And I actually wrote a post a few months ago on LinkedIn about how I feel like growing up listening to rap and hip hop helped me in that perspective, because it's all analogies and metaphors and wordplay. And so it's a lot easier to teach people those abstract concepts. I did want to ask a question about so the first code I ever wrote was as a data scientist. And I went to a boot camp. I came out of boot camp and they just, set me free in AWS writing Python. And I handed my CEO my first model and he's like, well, the detections are good, but you hard coded like 15 different things. It was a mess, right? It was an absolute disaster. So I'm wondering, for security teams who want to proactively engage people, data scientists, people who are using code but don't really realize what they're doing. If they want to use this book to do that, how would you go about doing that as a security pro?
Okay, this is great. When you said listening to rap, I thought you meant because you spoke so quickly when you facilitated. I was imagining, I'm like, she's doing like spoken word. But anyway, okay, back to the real question. So I actually have been hired a few times to teach data scientists, like several times now, I guess. And I find a whole thing. So I am not trying to speak ill of data scientists at all. They're brilliant geniuses, but they haven't been taught in software development. Generally, most of them don't come from that background. And so they don't usually follow a system development lifecycle. They're often not doing version control with their code. They're often not following like the most basic best practices. And I'm arguing with them, no, you cannot take that script from a customer and like run it directly against production databases. That's not okaysies with me. And they're like, why? So I actually have a big section on that in the book. And I actually say, like, note if you are a data scientist, this applies to you. Because I've had so many of them say, oh, but that doesn't apply to me. I'm a data scientist. I'm like, yes, it does. If you write code, it applies to you. And your code's just as important as mine. Maybe more important, right? Depending upon what they're working on. So I would say that if you can go into the database chapter and talk with them about that section, and then there's a dealing with sensitive data section, and talk with them about that, and then the SQL language section. Those would probably help declutter some things. And then everyone that writes code, in my opinion, and I realize that maybe I'm a little biased or maybe I'm just old, but we have to do version control. And we have to follow some basic best practices, like having some sort of system development lifecycle so that you can depend on what is going to happen each time. And like, even if you're just writing scripts, just having different environments that you promote them through, just having dev and prod instead of just prod. Like when I used to do counterterrorism, which I can't talk about very much about it, but I can say this. Guess how many top secret networks environments there are? One. Right? They're not like, oh yeah, we have the QA top secret environment. No, they don't. So you can't like promote through all these different things to test. You have to test locally as best you possibly can before you go to prod, right? And maybe some of them are in that situation. So I tried to give advice as best I could but the main advice is an SDLC is good for you.
You know what I liked?
Structure.
One thing I liked about the book was, just the practicalities of doing application security. It's just hard. Like AppSec is hard. Like, you mentioned about the difficulty of patching or how much is enough for usable security and then security release approval where people are trying to break the build. Just talk to us about like how startups want to move fast. Security teams want to make things secure. How do we find the right balance?
Oh, you are asking the most difficult question ever, but
Sorry.
I totally have thoughts.
Yeah.
So when I started like doing DevOps, I was like, oh, this is so exciting. I'm just going to break the build every time. And I was just doing an open source project, so I could break my own build whenever I wanted. And my two colleagues that worked on it with me were ridiculously patient with my crap. But then as I started working professionally, it turns out very few organizations break the build that often, because then they're very unpopular. And if they're instead, often what they'll do is like maybe it will pause and then someone makes a decision and they continue or not continue based on risk, right? And I've learned that social pressure can be a lot more powerful than a technical safeguard. And so one of the places I was working, they're like, we have to pass the build or everyone makes fun of you. It's really, really bad. You have to. So I want to have the tool first. So I deployed everything. So the moment they checked code in, they would get a report maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes later with everything. They would fix all those things and they would keep doing it till they passed. And then they would push to the CI. And they only did it every second Friday. And they had this cute name for it. They're like, we're going to ride the bullet train, which I thought was adorable. And like we would all talk about who wrote it, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, and so socially, you had to pass the bullet train. So that means everyone would fix everything before then. And I was like, oh, this is how you can run it from your CLI. This is how you could do it in your IDE. Like, I'll just let you have all the controls. This is great. And so I feel like so first of all, every organization is different, right? So some of us want to run the CI 10 times a day, and some of us run it every 2 weeks, and some of us don't have one. And that is okay. But you need to work with your developers, figure out what ways they are working that are okay with you and which ones you might want to try to negotiate on. So for instance, if everyone has their code in a different place and everyone's using a different language and everyone's doing a different SDLC and everyone is a different, like sort of like a cat, you're trying to herd them all into the same place. Like standardization is very powerful, very useful, really helps with security if you can get them to standardize on some things. But you still have to meet them where they are now. You can't be like, well, I'm going to wait 2 years till all the code's finally in GitHub, right? No. So I would say it's a lot of talking, unfortunately. And when I was a dev, I did not have to do very much talking. And I pride myself on having much better social skills now than then. I would just code my way through things. I'm like, oh, I'll just write a feature that does that. Or I'll just change the design and we'll do this. And I'll just tell them because I was the lead dev for a really long time. I'm just like, they'll do it as I say. And with security, that does not work at all. I have to persuade, I have to negotiate, I have to sometimes beg, borrow, and plead. And I was
Otherwise,
just like,
they'll just bypass you and ignore you. And I don't know. It's tough.
Yes, I have learned some hard lessons that way. Like I remember, I did a consulting gig, and this guy, he's like, yeah, we break the build, we run this SAST. It runs very, very quickly. I was like, whoa, show me. How'd you get it to do that? Because I was not experienced with that one going fast. And he's like, yeah, it runs. It takes 15 minutes. The devs wait. It's on blocking, this and that, every single build. I'm like, this is so cool. And then it was disabled. And then it was uninstalled. And then it was disabled. And every single instance had been turned off. There was a few in alerting mode, but almost all of it was disabled and or uninstalled. And it had taken him 2 years to roll that out. And he literally was like, I have to let you go because I don't want to cry in front of you. Like he was just so upset. He ended up leaving after working there 12 years. He was so upset. And he was a really great guy. And I was sad he left. I was like, no, you're brilliant. We can do this. He's like, no, this is betrayal, Tanya. Wow. Like he was really, really heartbroken. I don't know if you can imagine because he'd been on the dev team, then he switched to security and he had built their security program. And like he just felt heartbroken, and I would too. And so you have to have a lot of discussions. And like the devs told me, oh yeah, we told him it wasn't working, but he wasn't listening. I don't know where the truth is because he's like, they never told me. I'm like, oh, the truth's in there somewhere, right? So then when I started doing the job, I'm like, can I have feedback? Can I have feedback? Can I have feedback? And sometimes I screwed up and I had to change things. And
yeah, I mean that seems a common thread in, you pointed it out before I got a chance to to jump in, but the amount of communication, like you ratchet that up and all of a sudden so many things are better. The problems come out before they get really deeply ingrained. And, you're 6 weeks in and somebody's like, why didn't you tell me you had a blocker? Right. And you've gotten almost nothing done for 5 of these 6 weeks. But yeah, you're also right. Like that level of communication is hard. A lot of people in these roles, definitely not natural to them. Like they got into it so they wouldn't have to talk to people in the first place. Right. But that's just how it is.
That was one of the things that when I got into tech in finance, there's, I came from a very highly regulated investments. And so there usually is a right answer to things, and there's not a whole lot of back and forth. You get into tech and security, and there's all these special little snowflakes everywhere in an organization who they get to have a Windows laptop because they want to. They get to have a development box at their house that doesn't have EDR on it. Nobody knows why, but they're the only one who can write this part of the code base. So nobody's going to say, and it's bullshit. And,
there's some egos.
And the answer is always like, oh, well, only they can do what they can do. And it's like, well, if they're that inflexible, they can only do what they can do under specific circumstances. And how valuable are they really? And that's it. I think that, especially being autistic, right? And it's like, no, it's either right or wrong. And there is no, I get to do this because. It's like, you don't get to do this anymore. But that's not how the things work. And I don't know whether that's we're not bringing people to the top enough so we can agree on a common mission and then kind of filter it down. I've yet to figure that out, but I'm honestly kind of shocked at the degree to which everybody has their special toys and nobody's allowed to touch them. It's crazy.
And we've seen a couple breaches now start from an engineer's MacBook, right? With just credentials all over the place. These don't get viruses, and they get an info stealer installed. And just in the intro, some of you missed the intro, but one of the things we're talking about in the news today is that info stealers on Macs are up 101%. And they grab all those.
Asking for a friend who owns 4 Macs.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so Ryan would actually probably be best to take this. How do info stealers get on Macs, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's browser-based, and there's not a lot of good browser-based controls. Not all of it needs admin privileges to be installed, but we'll get into it in the news. I think, using as many managed devices as possible for authentication and relying on certs rather than stealing session tokens and such, we find to be pretty effective.
I thought you were going to say because Apple and Google can't play nice together and I have to install Chrome directly from a freaking Safari browser rather than the App Store, which makes malicious extensions really gosh darn hard to control. I thought that's what you were going to say.
Your words.
It's true. They don't get along.
All right. So we got to wrap up at this point. Great stuff. Love the book. We'll look for excuses to buy it for people. And I love how, you've got a little bit of everything in here. Like there's specific coding examples. You cover a lot of different programming languages, which is also something we're going to talk about in the news today, but languages that use null and languages that don't. That's our squirrel story for today is a woman whose last name, married name is null, is Null. And why she has problems with some government systems getting visas and stuff like that.
Is that the one who's 150 years old in the Social Security database?
And then you get into prioritizing and how to handle a pen test report. These are all things that typically don't see in a book. I love how you just kind of break some of these boundaries, where it's like, no, that can't be in this book because that's a different book. Or that can't be in this book because that's a different book. And you've put together, this one volume that, gets you there. Like where you can flip to the pen test section when you get that pen test. You don't have to read it back to front. You can just flip there and get some pointers. I love it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for being here. It was our pleasure for sure. We love talking about new books on here and having a chance to have you here. So thank you, Tanya, so much for coming on today.
My pleasure.
All right, stick around. We'll be back in a few moments, something, with the weekly enterprise news.